interest of New Zealand's security.
The Honourable Phil Goff.
Chairman, I want first to refer back to the speech of Peter Dunn, because I went back and checked what Peter Dunn 3 weeks ago said on Radio New Zealand, and this is what he said. Under no circumstances should the GCSB be able to spy on New Zealanders. Under no circumstances should the GCSB be able to spy on New Zealanders. And then Jane Patterson said, not even with a warrant? No, Peter Dunn said, not even with a warrant. This man, on the integrity of this man rests the government's ability to pass this legislation. Peter Dunn hasn't simply refined his position, he has totally contradicted the position that he took before. And when asked why, he said, willing buyer, willing seller. Well, he sold his soul. That was the sale price. What did the buyer give to him for that? Some people would be tempted to say 30 pieces of silver. I think probably more likely a nice ambassadorial position somewhere. But I've got to say to Peter Dunn that his position makes a mockery of his outrage and indignation that emails and phone records and swipe cards are being spied upon, because he is facilitating a piece of legislation that does not have adequate oversight to stop that very sort of abuse. Now I want to come to Mr Coleman and Ms Tolley. They presume to speak on behalf of former Prime Minister Helen Clark. They don't know Helen Clark. On this side of the House, we know Helen Clark and we know them. And I can tell Jonathan Coleman that Helen Clark's values have nothing in common with anything that he stands for, and that applies to Anne Tolley as well. Absolutely nothing in common. So don't come into this House and pretend to speak for Helen Clark, which actually, in terms of diplomatic protocol, is quite out of order, because she's an international official and those members should not breach that protocol anyway. And then Anne Tolley comes in and says the opposition is politicking. They're politicking with it. Normally you'd get bipartisan support. I want to say to Ms Tolley that we tried, and I was part of it, misses if you like. She misses the point every bloody time. I want to say to Anne Tolley that we worked really hard to try to find common ground which would balance the need to have security agencies with proper oversight over those agencies to ensure that the rights and the freedoms of New Zealanders not improperly to have their privacy breached were protected. We tried really hard. New Zealand First tried. As soon as John Key knew that he had his one-seat majority, relying on John Banks, the man who couldn't remember Kim.com, the man that lied about the donation, and the discredited Peter Dunn, who Mr Key sacked for leaking that cabinet paper. That's the sort of bipartisanship, Mrs Tolley, that you're after. Once you knew you had two disgraced members of parliament that this government could rely on, no effort was made to get consensus. This party has always supported the need for security agencies, but under proper controls. And then we had the Orwellian, Mr Coleman, talking about this bill doesn't widen powers, it narrows it. It narrows it. That's straight out of 1984. Well, Mr Coleman, it seems that the Law Society, the New Zealand Law Society, doesn't agree with you. What do they say in their submission? Point 15. It seems that the underlying objective of the legislation is to give the GCSB powers it lacked previously, the power to conduct surveillance on New Zealand citizens and residents. No explanation or justification for the conferral of this power is given. That, Mr Finlayson, is what your union, the New Zealand Law Society, told the Intelligence and Security Committee. Now, Mr Chairman, I want to speak in favour of the supplementary order paper that is in the name of David Shearer. And that proposes that there should be a full, Mr Chairman, that proposes that there should be a full and independent public inquiry. But in an endeavour to actually find common ground with the government, it says, if you can show us that there's an urgent reason why you need this legislation, put a sunset clause in and have the inquiry that will report at the time that the sunset clause runs out. That's a real effort to compromise, to find common ground, to get broad support, to get the best possible piece of legislation. Anybody who is rational would say that what you do before you decide to make ad hoc changes to the SIS bill, the telecommunications bill, the GCSB bill, is you actually have a full and independent inquiry, and that would look at a number of things. It would look at why wider powers are being sought. If you're going to broaden the power to allow the GCSB to spy on New Zealanders, for heaven's sake, justify it. Mr Coleman talked about process. Nothing wrong with process. I'm on the committee with Claire Curran that's looking at the telecoms bill. David Shearer was on the committee, Intelligence and Security Committee. We both wanted the same thing. We wanted the GCSB, the SIS, the police and the Defence Force to come before the committees and justify the extension of powers. Would the national government allow that to happen? The critical agencies? No. John Key vetoed the critical agencies being able even to present evidence in private before those committees. This bill is meant to be about openness and transparency if we're to rebuild the confidence in our security agencies, yet those agencies, those critical agencies, were not allowed by the Prime Minister to present evidence or to answer questions. What has that man got to hide that he wouldn't allow that to happen? We want to know in the broad inquiry whether the agencies are competent and effective. I've worked with those agencies for 9 years. I've got to say, Mr Chairman, that I think a lot could be done to improve the competency and the efficiency of those agencies. 9 years of working with them, I think I've got the right to make that sort of judgment. The third thing that the inquiry would look at is what sort of safeguards are required so that the agencies could do a proper job in looking after New Zealand's security but not be at risk of breaching those powers. And when you've got two insiders, Murray Schroff, who was a Cabinet Secretary for well over a decade, saying as Privacy Commissioner this legislation should not proceed without a broader inquiry, then I say to the government and I say to the Attorney-General, listen to Murray Schroff. She knows how the system works. When David McDowell, the former head of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, says this does not have enough safeguards, even if you had a Prime Minister that was interested in exercising scrutiny over the GCSB, you could not guarantee that that Prime Minister would be getting the information that he or she needs, then you should be listening to those people. They're not wild-eyed radicals. They're people who know the system, know how the system has been abused, and say this isn't good enough. Mr Coleman nods his head. His New Zealand Defence Force had on record, he didn't know about it, nor did I, but had on record that you are subversive if you bring the government into disrepute. Stand up all the subversives on this side of the House. That's our job. We hold the government to account. And worse than that, that Defence Force security manual said that investigative journalists were within the category of being subversive. Investigative journalists were defined as subversive. Now, Mr Coleman, they never told you that was in their manual, yet you come to this House and say, give the power under this clause in this section to the Defence Force to be able to get information from the GCSB, and they have that sort of attitude.
Order. Now, order. When I'm on my feet, there'll be silence. Now, point of order. The Honourable
Mr. Chair,
Doctor...
just for the record, it was the Labor government that signed that provision off.
Order. No, order. Quiet. Now that is not helpful, because that's not a point of order, that's a debating point. Now, Honourable Phil Goff.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd be well compensated by receiving a third call on this bill for that unwarranted interruption. Mr Speaker, unwarranted, absolutely, no pun intended. Mr Speaker, the full and independent inquiry is patently necessary when 40% of New Zealanders, Mrs Tolley, say that they have no trust and confidence in the GCSB. 40% of New Zealanders. That does not allow that agency to operate right now with the confidence of New Zealanders, and even less so when they have a further extension of their powers.
Honourable Christopher Finlayson.
It's very sad that that previous speaker's been